Support for this episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere is made possible by the Wessex Press, the premier publisher of books about Sherlock Holmes and his world. Find them online at wessexpress.com. And the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlockian scholarship since 1946. Subscriptions available at bakerstreetjournal.com.
I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, episode 104. Sherlockians at Chautauqua.
I hear of Sherlock everywhere since you became a chronicler.
In a world where it's always 1895, comes I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, a podcast for devotees of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the world's first unofficial consulting detective.
I've heard of you before. You're Holmes the meddler, Holmes the busybody, Holmes the Scotland Yard Jack in office.
The game's afoot as we discuss goings-on in the world of Sherlock Holmes enthusiasts, the Baker Street Irregulars, and popular culture related to the great detective.
As we go to press, sensational developments have been reported.
So join your hosts, Scott Monty and Burt Wolder, as they talk about what's new in the world of Sherlock Holmes.
You couldn't have come at a better time!
Hey! It's that time again. It's time for I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast for Sherlock Holmes devotees where it's always 1895. I'm Scott Monty.
And I'm Burt Wolder.
How about that? And I don't know about you, but I just flew in from Chautauqua, and boy, are my arms educated.
And boy, are my arms misspelled. Friends, hold your hands up out there if you can successfully spell Chautauqua.
It's a lot of A's and a lot of U's.
And E-I-E-I-O.
Ironically enough, even though we were in West State, New York, I didn't see a single farmer on the land of Chautauqua.
Oh. Well, we saw the farmer's market where that happens, I think, Monday through Saturday. But you're right, we didn't see any farmers.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, for those of you who have no clue what we're talking about, we were just at the Chautauqua Institution, which is a non-profit adult education center / summer resort located in Chautauqua, New York, which is on the very western edge of the state, down by that jog in Pennsylvania by Lake Erie. About 750 acres that have been dedicated to adult education and I guess some religious teaching. It was originally founded as a teaching camp for Sunday school teachers, and we even saw a scale replica of the Holy Land, just to make it that much more real. But we were there for Sherlockian purposes, weren't we?
Yes, we were. The conference entitled "The Mind and Art of Sherlock Holmes," which was brilliantly led by a team of folks, the leader of whom was our pal Bob Katz, who has been working on this, I think, for a couple of years. But, of course, Marianne Bradley and Mike Whalen and, a cast of many made this possible. And what an agenda.
What an agenda indeed. And, the Baker Street Irregulars host these gatherings, these expeditions, right about once every 4 years or so. And the previous ones were in Salt Lake City, in Vermissa Valley, in Pennsylvania. It was actually Mock Chunk, Pennsylvania. And in Los Angeles in 2012. That was the most recent one. And these events are open to anyone who would care to dedicate an entire weekend to this kind of thing. And it's filled with lots of speakers, lots of things to do and see. And frankly, even though the glue that held it all together were these educational opportunities, I think for us, and this is following on episode 103 with Al and Julie Rosenblatt, it's really about friendship. It's an opportunity to spend a long weekend with some of these people that we only see for fleeting moments amidst hundreds of other people during the BSI Weekend once a year, for example. So it's an opportunity to forge new friendships and to reinvest in old friendships around the subject of Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah. And how good to see some of our friends like James O'Leary, who gave us just wonderful T-shirts. He produced a very limited run of special I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere T-shirts, and it was great to see James and Michael Keane and Andy Solberg and, you can't really start naming people, Henry Boote, because it would just go on and on and on. But that is, as Julie said, it started with Sherlock Holmes, but now it's all about friendships. Yeah.
Absolutely. And some of the people that we met, and even some of the folks that we're going to give you some excerpts from in our show this time, you will hear from in future episodes. These are people that have interesting stories to tell or that are doing fascinating things in, not just in the world of Sherlock Holmes, but in general, just in life. And we want to bring their stories to you.
Yeah.
But before we do tell their stories, we have the story of one Wessex press.
While the United Kingdom plans to leave the European Union, the ancient Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Wessex is committed to remain. We are now rebuilding the system of shires established by King Egbert during the 8th century, and we will again conquer Surrey, Sussex, Kent, Essex, and Mercia, along with parts of Dumnonia, and regain the overlordship of the Northumbrian king. But all this costs money. That's why you need to visit WessexPress.com, where your purchase of our unique Sherlockian volumes pays for enforcing our borders, building a central bank, maintaining our roads, and military defense. Friends, we tell the old stories and sing the old songs. Help us fashion our future by reaching for the past, and the pleasure only a volume from the Wessex Press can provide. Choose yours today. I am pretty excited about the system of shires that good King Egbert created in the 8th century. I can't wait till that's up and running.
Fantastic. Well, let's shirk the shiredom and get to the action.
Yeah, now we decided this was a lot of fun for us because we got to do a lot of remote recording, and rather than simply make records or gather audio tracks of presentations and discussions, we set our sights on talking to 6 or 7 folks during the weekend, just for a few minutes, to see what was on their mind. And one of the topics that we've been meaning to develop for our show is the subject of Sherlockian spouses. What are these people like who have the fortune or misfortune to be married to people like us? Well, we found one notable Sherlockian spouse there who is very happy to identify himself as Mr. Bonnie MacBird, as he likes to say. And he is Alan Kay, a noted American computer scientist who's best known for a number of things. He's a fellow of all sorts of societies, but mostly for his pioneering work on object-oriented programming and really the whole notion of a window computer interface. And so we talked a little bit to Alan Kay, and we asked him how he and Bonnie happened to meet and what his take was on the subject of Sherlock Holmes.
I met Bonnie when she was writing Tron in the late 70s, and she came up to Silicon Valley looking for technical advice. And we like to say the marriage turned out better than the movie. I wouldn't say I'm a Sherlockian in the same qualitative sense as these folks are, but of course I read the canon and remember a fair amount of it, and like the Granada series and Basil Rathbone and Benedict Cumberbatch and all of that. So
how does Holmes as a character and the mind of Sherlock Holmes, how do you view that? Do you see parallels to scientific personalities to programming to deduction.
Well, we humans are such foolers of ourselves. We can find parallels to anything we want, but that's why astrology works so well. I think the thing is my background was in both science and the arts. My mother was a musician and excellent draftsperson. She could really draw. Her father was an artist, a musician, and a writer, and my father was a physiologist. So the dual personality of Sherlock Holmes, which, as Bonnie points out, many people don't realize how dual it is between the super rational, quantitative, and the actual emotion that an introvert like him has. Of course, anybody relates to it. But I think Sherlock Holmes is a universal character, like many religious figures, and so there's enough in a character like that for people to relate to whatever part of a character like that appeals to them.
Isn't that interesting?
It's great.
I love his remark. That's why astrology works so well.
Well, I hadn't realized what a legend he is in the computer science industry.
Yeah, I was just tickled to meet him.
Yeah. Oh, and how cool that the two of them actually united over Tron.
Yeah.
A computer, video game related movie.
Yeah.
That was something.
Yeah.
So we've met Bonnie MacBird before on these airwaves. You may recall that she talked with us about her book, Art in the Blood, on an episode. And we thought we'd turn it over to Bonnie herself, right? Because we were talking about Sherlockian spouses. Well, this is the Sherlockian on the other side of this spouse. And Alan, of course, talked about that dual personality of Sherlock Holmes. And we picked up on that with Bonnie MacBird. We asked her what drove her to look at the Vernet family, which, of course, was in her book, Art in the Blood. She looked at them over several generations in her presentation. Did she see any reflections of Holmes in the history that she uncovered?
If you look at, art as being the artistic temperament in towns as being inherited, then what else did he inherit along with that? And so a glimpse at these folks and their crazy history would be instructive. In some ways, I think of Sherlock Holmes as very resourceful and very tough, but also in some ways hampered by the emotionality of the artistic temperament. And so I was interested to see what part of that came from them. And all of the Vernet, especially the three in the direct line, faced great hardship and were very emotional people and lived in tumultuous times, and they all overcame their hardships to have very, very successful careers, and in that way they're very much like Holmes. And the resilience, the emotionality, and the talent are very much like him.
Isn't that interesting?
Well, that sounds like me.
I was going to say the same thing about myself.
Yeah. See, it's astrology.
It is, yes. I see a parallel there. Yeah. But isn't that interesting? And, in her presentation, she went through 3 or 4 generations of Vernets, all artists, all in amazing times, some heading off to the guillotine and some not. And it was a remarkable bit of scholarship associated with that. And speaking of scholarship, so many readers have found Holmes's adventures transporting and reassuring and familiar and comfortable. Well, Glen Miranker discovered stories and parodies created by the hundreds during World War I in magazines that were put together and printed and distributed by the soldiers, by the frontline soldiers for themselves. And after his fascinating presentation, we buttonholed Glen and just talked to him a little bit about this subject.
When the centennial came around, I renewed some reading about World War I, which I was interested in, and I had known about the Wipers Times, which was a trench magazine. That is a magazine that was published. Material was gathered done by soldiers, gathered up in the trenches. And in the case of that particular publication, the Wipers Times, was actually printed, just behind the front lines. And I said, "Gee, I wonder just how widespread." This phenomenon of trench magazines and of Sherlock Holmes as one of the distractions, one of the entertainments in this magazines were. My expectation, based on nothing, was there were probably another dozen or two of these things. And when I started looking into it, I found there are literally hundreds and hundreds of different titles of these trench magazines. And among all these magazines, I was able to find over 150 Sherlockian stories, cartoons, references. It's impossible for me to understand how the soldiers, even if they weren't wounded, survived. It was World War I on the front was a hell. Which is simply unimaginable to me, between the lousy conditions, the near constant shelling, the present, when you had a battle, it's go over the top and have a 30% chance of being shot down. But they developed an incredible esprit de corps and sort of fatalistic outlook in this environment, and it's quite clear that part of it were these publications, these trench magazines, which are, with few exceptions, not so much newsy as just very clever, sarcastic, sardonic, a little subversive, and with all kinds of reminders of home. And one reminder of home is clearly was, by looking at these magazines, Sherlock Holmes. But I think as I said, the publication that of the many that I at least glanced through, that I think most typifies the form is the Wipers Times.
And you, at one point, I think when you said you started this, you were thinking that maybe here's an opportunity to create a complete catalog of these things.
That was my initial thought. I knew about the Wipers Times, and I thought, obviously I didn't know what I was talking about. I said, well, how many could there be? Another couple of dozen. And as I looked in the British National Archive and the Imperial War Library, in the U.S., the National Archive, I discovered that there were, I found, and I have no delusion that it's complete, 900 different magazine titles. And each of those, of course, had multiple, most of those had multiple issues. Some only one or two, but some a dozen or more. So cataloging them was not practical, or a life's work, one or the other.
Fascinating.
Really is. I mean, it for me picked out an area that, I mean, it makes total sense that the soldiers would have wanted to entertain themselves in between, the warfare, but it was something I'd never heard of before.
Yeah, myself as well. And how wonderful that a good chunk of that was Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah.
With all kinds of names, he gave
Shell Shock Moans.
Yes.
Sir Arthur Gowen Boyle. That's great.
Yeah.
So, well, we finished up with Glen. And of course, we wanted to talk to Henry Boote. Henry, we all know from the BSI Weekend, particularly at the BSI dinner. He provides the musical accompaniment and sometimes the actual musical entertainment that goes along with the dinner. And Henry actually does a nightclub act in his real life, and that's for us. That was one of the highlights of the weekend. The lobby was booming. We had Sherlockians up there dancing with each other, which was nice. And this is all because of Henry's enthusiasm and his talent as a performer and entertainer. So we asked him how he first brought music to Sherlockian gatherings.
My first event where I became involved on a level other than a local seance with Mrs. Hudson's Cliff Dwellers, I was very active in bringing music each meeting. And we would meet twice a year, as you know, because you've been there. I would provide music in the form of sing-alongs, but there were sing-alongs and pieces that had been written long before I became part of that group. Irving Campbell, one of the founders, and a number of the other early members were all brilliant singers and musicians and tongue-in-cheek fun times. So I just came along and fell into it.
But these days, sometimes the BSI dinners, the musical numbers, this is like a mini Broadway production. You bring the keyboards, the equipment, there's a program, there's a theme. A couple of years ago, there was sort of a musical almost. Well, actually, it was a musical put on with half a dozen people singing. So how did all that come about?
I've been a nightclub entertainer at one point in my life, and I've staged many different performances, and I felt that the BSI dinner would be a perfect opportunity, and Mike Whalen was gracious enough to allow me to perform at these different functions, and it worked out. And over the years, he's allowed me more leverage, not leverage, that's not the right word. He's allowed me more opportunity to expand upon that.
Yeah. So how do you go about figuring out, because you've got a very busy schedule, you are entertainer, a performer, an educator. How do you go about figuring out, okay, we've got a dinner coming up, and this is probably what we're going to do? And
when Mike Whalen gets to a point where he's got the program pretty much figured out what he's going to do, he throws out some ideas that he'd like to do, and then I usually take it and I run with it. Sometimes I come up with original things, but the original part of it is only after I've learned what he's looking for. The last dinner, as you know, was dedicated, my dedication, what I write all those original pieces, was all, based upon the women's starting in the BSI for 25 years. Yeah. So that's where that came from. And Susan Dallinger doing her shtick, she came and rehearsed at my house, and
it's fabulous.
Yeah, that was a great piece. I thought that was the highlight of the night.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm actually in the process right now of writing a book all about music in the canon, but also music as it relates to what you're asking me about.
Oh, fantastic. Well, we will certainly look forward to having Henry on the show as a future guest to talk about just that.
Mm. Yeah, over the years, he's just discovered a great number of turn-of-the-century popular songs that I had never heard, all featuring Sherlock Holmes, which are a real treat. And speaking of a real treat, we also talked to our friend Tim Greer, who is, like Henry, an educator, but he's also a stage director and an irregular. And he had spoken about the challenges of presenting that very familiar scene, that very familiar 221B Baker Street flat on stage. But also during his talk, and we got into this for a minute or two with him here, he revealed the origins of a particular item of Sherlockian furniture that dates back to Sidney Paget.
When we're in a theater and an audience is supposed to be looking at the scene, we don't have a window in. We're outside of a circle looking in. That's why you see the Baker Street flat sort of butterflied out, open. It's a room with many walls, cascading 7 walls or something like that sometimes. And the different ways to attack that problem or to solve it. We looked at some of the non-representational stagings of it, where it's very abstracted. Some of the ones that, on the other hand, attempt to be representational and give us a sort of a more realistic depiction of what a room would look like. And compare the two, balance the two, and ask if they address the questions of the productions in which they live. We've done a few at the place where I am also the director of theater. I have a fantastic scenic designer who I work with. It's great if you can work with a wildly talented designer. His name is Robert Fudge. And he did, you saw some of his designs for The Crucifer of Blood, which we did at MUS. And we have a very limited backstage, but we're getting the most out of it, as you can see in those production photos. There are 4 legs to the table. Can we build it? Can we cast it? Can we sell it? Should we? Do we have the actors to do it? Do we have the capacity to build it? Will anyone want to come see it? And does this play deserve to live? Should anyone do it? And then finally, the one that we looked at today, which is the blocking and the set and pretty much everything, to me, have to be first functional. It would have to work and not cause a meltdown in the middle of the performance. It can't be something that barely works. It has to work every time because this is a repeatable live event. It has to be functional. It has to be meaningful. It has to... After it's functional, it has to tell the story to the audience. And then maybe, if we get those two things down, we can think about being artistic and cool. But sometimes you'll see people maybe make a mistake trying to go for the cool thing before they've got the functional and the meaningful down. So we try and keep first things first that way.
In all the dramatizations you've seen of Holmes on the stage, have you ever had the experience of sitting in the theater and the curtain comes up and you say, wow, these guys have really got it right?
I've seen some very satisfying 221B sets. I think there have been some good designs at the Eille Theater in Houston, Texas. I've seen a couple of good 221Bs back a few years ago. There was a production that the Circuit Playhouse, which is part of the Playhouse on the Square family of theaters in Memphis, did of a play I'm not especially fond of, Sherlock's Last Case by Charles Marowitz, but it had a great 221B set in it back in the 1980s, I think it was. And it's maybe the last really good one that I've seen locally. I've traveled and seen quite a few terrific ones.
And in films, you talked a bit about the Peter Cushing, Andre Morel set, which really was beautifully done. And you pointed out something which I didn't know, which is the important role of the octagonal Moroccan table.
Well, I became interested in it just because I started noticing it on so many film and theater sets, and you can trace it back, I think, to that one Sidney Paget drawing from The Empty House. And Susan Dallinger, who, as you know, is an authority on the Gillette play, assures me that it was a piece of Gillette's stage set, which Paget, I assume, would have seen in the London production. So I'm still trying to run that down. But you'll see it again in Saintsbury's set. You'll see it in the Robert Downey Jr. Guy Ritchie films. They have it. You'll see it on Cushing's set if you know when to look. You'll see it. It's in the Granada series, of course. They have the same table. It just shows up again and again. I feel like everyone takes it from that one illustration of Sidney Paget. It just seems like, I guess that's a thing you have to have. And it's a little bit, I mentioned in there, it's a little bit of my litmus test for whether these people have really scrutinized the work of past designers and done their homework. I was like, oh, I see they have the little Moroccan table. This was probably going to be a good production.
Who knew? We need now to all go out and find these little Moroccan tables to complete the Sherlockian ambience in our homes. Oh, I wonder if Denny Dobry has a little Moroccan table.
Well, if he doesn't already, I guarantee you that he was probably sourcing one while we were sitting there watching that talk, because it's one of those things that of course I've seen that before. You just never called it out the way Tim did.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of course, and things we've seen before, perhaps this would be a good time to devote just a moment to the Baker Street Journal.
The mind and art of Sherlock Holmes was the subject of the Chautauqua Conference in September 2016. In a peaceful, historic setting such as the Chautauqua Institution, it was right that we celebrated those two things, as it's a mecca for adult education, particularly in the arts. We were treated to a number of talks, but the first, on the history and future of Chautauqua, reminded us of our own Sherlockian hobby, a hobby that we pursue through the pages of the Baker Street Journal. John Schmitz, the archivist of the institution, reminded us that the entity has always stood for three things: appreciating the Sabbath, big tent inclusiveness, and the automatic formation of a community when we gather. We could say very similar things about being a Sherlockian. We appreciate quiet time away from the busy world, perhaps when we take the time to read the canon and reflect on its many mysteries. The Baker Street Irregulars believe in big tent inclusiveness, and you needn't be a member of the BSI to subscribe to the journal or to attend its various events. And when we gather, we form bonds, whether we create new ones or fortify long-standing ones. The Baker Street Journal is just one way for you to keep up with these traditions and community. It's not required, but it certainly helps, as it serves the need of a virtual and intellectual campfire to gather round on a regular basis. Won't you put your mind to the mind and art of Sherlock Holmes in the pages of the Baker Street Journal by subscribing at bakerstreetjournal.com today? So one of the other things that we had an absolute treat in store for us at Chautauqua was a number of silent films. We're going to talk about the Gillette film in just a moment. And, of course, you've heard about the Gillette film or read about the Gillette film over the past 2 years on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. But we also had the opportunity to be the first United States audience to view 3 Eille Norwood films from the 1920s. Norwood did, I think it was 47 Sherlock Holmes films. There were 45 shorts and 2 longer ones. The 2 longer ones were The Sign of Four and The Hound of the Baskervilles. But there were a collection of these films that had never been screened before in the United States, and the British Film Institute has them. And through the good graces of Bob Katz and Russell Merritt and a number of other people, in conjunction with the BFI, as well as a company owned by Andrew Lloyd Webber's group, we were able to see those 3 films. And it wasn't just enough to see the films. We saw them in a period theater with seen on a 35 millimeter variable speed projector. Very specialized piece of equipment. There are very few in existence, and one of them happened to be on the grounds of Chautauqua Institution. And we saw these 3 films, and they were, let's see, what were they? They were, I can remember here.
Crooked Man, Colonel Henry Wood, of course.
Stockbroker's Clerk,
right,
and The Musgrave Ritual. Right. And as if it wasn't amazing enough to see these films for the very first time in their form, we also had an accompanist there, a pianist by the name of Philip Carli, who does this on a regular basis. Philip Carli has had over 100 films that have gone into the Library of Congress that he has provided the piano accompaniment for. 100 silent films. And the amazing thing is, if you looked at him while he was in the theater, there was no music on his piano. And in our tour after the films were over, we asked Russell, well, how many times did Philip screen these films before to get the hang of it? And amazingly, Russell said, oh, this was the first time these films were shown in the United States. Nobody saw them before we all sat in that theater together. So that was probably, to me, one of the most amazing things about the whole presentation. And here we have a little clip from the introduction of the Crooked Man, Philip Carli at the piano. was something.
Amazing.
And we could go on, but here we are enjoying the film, and you can't even see it.
Well, neither can we any longer.
Yeah.
But isn't that amazing? If you think about the fact that each one of these were one-reelers, so they ran about 20 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
So Philip sat in a darkened theater looking at the screen and played for about an hour, impromptu, to accompany action that he'd never seen before.
Yeah, it was. With each successive film, I just became more and more astounded that he was doing this, that anyone could do it.
Yeah.
But this was how music or films were shown at one time. The pianist, hadn't seen the film and had to be on his toes, and it created a very effective atmosphere.
Yeah.
Well, that brought us to Russ Merritt, who, of course, gave the opening and closing remarks before and after each film. Well, Russ also was there with us to talk about the William Gillette film and to host a panel afterwards. We're going to get into a conversation here with Russ and then share some music from the Gillette film.
What made this particularly interesting was that this was dipping into the series of films that have never been restored. So we're seeing them in their prime condition. And the likelihood is we're not going to be seeing them anytime soon ever again. They were kept out of the United States to begin with because of the dispute between Samuel Goldwyn, who had come out with his version of Sherlock Holmes with John Barrymore, and with Sir Oswald Stoll, whose company was producing this series of, count 'em, 45 Sherlock Holmes shorts, not to mention the two features, Hound of the Baskervilles and Sign of Four. We never saw Sign of Four, and we only saw the first 15 of the Eille Norwoods, and they came and went as quickly as you can bat an eye. And by that time, Goldwyn had entered the fray, and so Stoll threw up his hands saying, I don't need the American distribution, and made a considerable fortune out of these with the European, the Australian, the Japanese, and the Indian markets. And so there they sat. Now we have another kind of legal situation in which Stoll, having donated these films to the British Film Institute in 1930, had them set there. Then in 2000, Andrew Lloyd Webber had bought the Stoll theaters and discovered that as part of the contract, these films are included. So who has physical possession of the films? Either the BFI or the successors to the really useful group, which is Andrew Lloyd Webber's company.
And you made a little news the other night because you announced that the last Sherlock Holmes silent film ever produced in 1929, which had mysteriously wound up in Poland, a German production with a global cast, has now been discovered, and with any luck at all, within the next 2 or 3 years, it might be available.
I'm so delighted, Bert, that you were paying attention, that it was a late hour that we made that announcement, and that's exactly right, that this is the last silent Sherlock Holmes film, the German version, yet another German version of The Hound of the Baskervilles, directed by an extraordinary director named Richard Oswald. And it has an American Sherlock Holmes. It has a German legend as Stapleton named Fritz Rasp. And it goes on. Well, this is a long-term project because the film is in such fragile condition that you can't even project it yet. We have to wait for it to be scanned. And for all this to happen, we need to have some legal rights cleared, and we need to raise money for the Polish Film Institute. This is the Polish Filmoteca to do the necessary operations. The great news is that Rob Byrne, who restored the Gillette film, is now actively involved. And so that will create real incentive for the archives to get going. So we're expecting maybe 2020 being the year. This is Carlisle Blackwell, for those of you hanging on your seats wondering who is the new star of this Sherlock Holmes. But an American actor who goes to Austria and then to Germany in order to make detective films.
Fascinating story.
Isn't that fascinating? Now we have something to look forward to until 2020.
Well, I guess we'll have to keep the show going until then.
Well, we specialize in long shows, so why don't we just do one show that's 4 years long?
We're approaching that. Well, before we get too far, let's make sure we get in that the music that, of course, again, Philip Carli on the piano provided to the Gillette film while we were watching that one. Of course, this time on a baby grand piano. Someone asked Phil, because he had played, I think, at the premiere in San Francisco. Someone asked him if this was the same score that he used in San Francisco. And he said, no.
What score?
Different every time. So how wonderful. What we will do, because that while the music is interesting, it doesn't really have as much meaning without the film, and vice versa. So we will put that short clip, that video clip, up on the show notes for this episode. You can find that at ihose.co/ihose104, along with all the other notes here.
Yeah. Well, that gets us just about to the end of our little opportunity here for you to eavesdrop on these conversations that took place this past weekend. But we have a terrific conversation to conclude. One of the guests, one of the attendees at the conference was screenwriter Jeffrey Hatcher, who wrote the screenplay for Mr. Holmes, the recent Bill Condon, Ian McKellen film, who talked to us about his connections with Sherlock Holmes. I didn't realize this, but he's also had a long engagement with mystery fiction and had been in the past, among other things, a screenwriter for Columbo. And he has a new Sherlock Holmes play coming. And those are a couple of the things that we talked to Jeffrey about.
Well, I think I first got the annotated William S. Baring Gould when I was 11 or 12, when I was a kid. I mean, I knew Sherlock Holmes as a character in popular art, so to speak, and then you read him. I think very few people probably hear of him first through a story. It probably leaches in some odd way, you know what I mean, from a cartoon, a comic book or so. But it's only come back into my life in a big way over the last 10 years. It was an adolescent thing, a college-age thing, and then I don't think I really geared in until I read Slight Trick of the Mind by Mitch Cullen, and I was asked to adapt it. And then since then I've spent, a good few years in Holmes land.
But before that, you've had a longer career as a playwright and screenwriter, including an episode, I think, of Columbo, haven't you?
Oh, yeah, that was great fun, because I grew up watching Columbos. And then when they brought them back in the 90s, I had an idea for one. And I was able to get it from Dan Luria, who was a friend, and he was a mutual friend of Peter Falk. And I got it to Peter Falk, and Peter said, yeah, I love that idea. Bring it out. And so we shot it, and I rewrote a couple of ones also, off to the side. The one I wrote was called Ashes to Ashes, and Patrick McGowan played a Hollywood undertaker. He murdered Rue McClanahan, and he used Sally Kellerman as his alibi, and we had people like Richard Libertini in it. It was a lot of fun. Compared to Holmes, who almost springs fully grown off the page, Columbo doesn't exist without Peter Falk. Columbo was supposed to be Thomas Mitchell or Bing Crosby.
Yes, Crosby, right?
Yeah, and every time Peter Falk said, I'm available, they'd try Crosby again. He said, no, I'd rather be golfing, boys. When Falk became such a huge hit, and I said, remember, guys, when you didn't want me? Well, I want a lot more per episode now.
Now, the Columbo model, of course, is the inverted detective story popularized by Austin Freeman. Very
Exactly.
different from Conan Doyle. But are you also a Freeman fan, a Dr. Thorndike fan?
I am, and I stumbled onto Freeman for two reasons. One, Freeman is referenced in Sleuth. At some point, Andrew Wyke says, the golden age of when cabinet ministers had thrillers by their bedsides. And he references Freeman, I think. And then, of course, when you learn about Columbo, you realize, well, the inverted mystery goes back. There's Dialogue for Murder. There are a couple of weird Hollywood movies that are very much like a Columbo. There's one with Rosalind Russell and Sidney Greenstreet as the cop. And you go like, wow, that's like a Columbo episode. But the inverted mystery, the Freeman ones, I don't know why somebody hasn't done them over at the BBC.
Oh, I'd love that.
I think they have done like one or two.
Yeah. In the rivals of Sherlock Holmes
Exactly.
years ago on TV, I think somebody like John Neville played Thorndike.
Yeah, but they're that crappy video. Every time a door slams, the set falls over. But I think they're ripe for the picking.
Yeah, I do too.
And inverted mysteries are the Columbos really nailed the structure of the murderer of the week. Usually a star who was sliding down just a little bit or was a little overripe. But all those actors, Donald Pleasance and
Pleasance was great.
McGowan and Jack Cassidy and Ruth Gordon, kind of as Agatha Christie.
Yes.
So it'd be lovely to bring one of those back.
Now, you wrote the screenplay for Slight Trick of the Mind, as you mentioned, which was directed by Bill Condon. And Condon is a specialist in presenting us with amazing personalities that immediately engage the audience in the question of how did they get that way. And the screenplay shows you how. So I'm thinking Gods and Monsters, but I'm also thinking, obviously, you're Mr. Holmes. What was the work experience like of you with Condon and developing the story and converting the novel to the screen?
Well, for years, it took about 10 years to get the script made. And for a number of years, there was a period when either different directors were attached or kind of attached, and everybody always wanted a lot of action. And so the flashbacks would have had much more active Holmes, not Robert Downey active, but more physical. And when I met Bill, when he was attached to it, he said, aside from anything else, Ian is 75 years old, and he's not going to run down the Strand and jump on the back of a carriage or anything. And he said, I want to contain the mystery to its key elements into as close as we can to one interchange between Holmes and this woman. And so we kind of kept boiling it down to its essentials that way. And I think it was terrific, not simply because, Ian wasn't going to go running around, but because it was the right idea dramatically, too. Bill's a great guy. He's a terrific writer. He's got an Oscar, and at one point I thought, Bill could easily rewrite this stuff on his own. And you're thinking, well, I hope he doesn't. But but one day he buzzed me. I was at home, and they were in London, and he said, there's a scene we were working on yesterday. We think it needs something. And he said, Ian made up the following. He ad-libbed the following. And he read me like 3 or 4 sentences. And he said, I think this is the right idea, but it doesn't sound like Holmes. It sounds like Ian. So could you put it through the machine again, so to speak, and put it through Holmes' diction and send it to us, which I did. It was, 5 minutes work. The sort of thing Bill could have done on the back of his hand. But it's kind of a tribute to the way he thinks about, I'm the director on this, you're the writer on this. We're doing different kinds of work. you respect people who are like that, because not everybody in the business is like that. So it was great, and that's why we're going to be working on this new one. So.
And you did mention that in a forthcoming film involving again Sir Ian and Bill Condon. But tonight you showed us the construction part of a new play that's tentatively titled Holmes and Watson, that has to do with Watson and Holmes after the Reichenbach and the identifying of the believed lost Holmes. Is identity and perception and reality, has that been an interest of yours in dramatic work, or do you have some different view of the structure of this?
Well, this is probably the conversation you should have with my Boswell, I'm sure, if I ever get one. But I do think that after, I'm almost 60, so I've been writing for a long time. You do realize after a while a lot of the plays are about people who say they're one thing and turn out to be something else. They're either disguising an incident, an identity, a background. Certainly people disguise their motives and what they're going to do, because a lot of the stuff I do is either murder mysteries, but often comedies too. I adapted The Government Inspector by Gogol, and that's the famous, we think he's a government inspector. Right. He knows he's a schlemp for the city. And so I think it's also the projects you choose, or the projects that choose you. But I'm always fascinated in people who, we think they're someone, and then at a certain point it is revealed, no, they're actually someone else entirely. And sometimes it's for melodramatic purposes, but sometimes I've written a lot about actors, and what it's like when your personality is taken away from you, or the way you identify yourself to yourself and the world is taken from you. How do you remake yourself? So, yeah, it's very much a part.
Isn't that fun to look at this whole process through Jeff Hatcher's
Now, he's a fascinating guy, and we didn't mention this before, but he gave the Distinguished Speakers Lecture at the BSI Weekend in 2016. And it was about an entirely different subject. It was about his childhood and obviously behind the scenes with Mr. Holmes, and just a fascinating guy to listen to. I could sit there all night and listen to him and watch him present, because he had fun with it, and we did too.
We did, and now we've got a whole bunch of future guests to see if we can bring into the program over the next year.
How about that? Well, if you would like to come into the program in some meaningful way, one of the ways to do that is to write to us. We can be reached through our website, ihearofsherlock.com, via email. Just shoot us an email at comment@ihearofsherlock.com. Or go to our Facebook page. Like us. Please. You like us. You really like us on Facebook. Interact with us on Twitter or on Instagram. We are I Hear of Sherlock in all of those places.
Or print out a blank piece of paper from your nearest inkjet printer and picking up a number 2 pencil, not a number 3 or number 4, but a number 2 pencil. Write us a note and then fold it very carefully and slide it into the USB slot on your laptop or desktop computer.
Jam it right in there.
And we will receive that. Yeah, jam it right in there. We will get it and unfold it and unpack it and enjoy it.
And, of course, the fine folks at what has become, or what used to be Ma Bell, would love it if you picked up the receiver and put your finger around that rotary dial. Wait, no one does that anymore. Hit those keypad buttons to the tune of 774-221-7323. That's 774-221-READ. And leave us a voicemail. If you're coherent and cogent enough, we might even play it on the air. And if you are so inclined to show any kind of monetary support for the show, we would of course appreciate that. It's not required, but we do make it easy. There are 2 ways to go about doing that. The easiest way and the most convenient way for us is through that Patreon button that you may see right on the site or right in the show notes. You can pledge as much or as little as you like, and you're only charged per episode. So if we don't make something, you don't get charged. Whatever you think the show is worth, $1 an episode, $5 an episode, $25 an episode. There are rewards associated with each level, and we encourage you to check it out. Also, try patreon.com/IHearOfSherlock.
Mm-hmm. And we're very excited particularly about conferences, because I think Mike Whalen has now agreed that on future Baker Street Irregulars conferences, if you want towels in your room, you are going to need to donate to I Hear of Sherlock, which is really exciting, because some people will want towels and washcloths, and I think this is going to be a money spinner for us.
And if you donate enough, Bert and I will personally bring the towels to your room.
Yes, absolutely.
So have a cocktail or two ready, because we will be parched by the time we reach the top of the stairs.
Yes, and we'll bring the ice. I mean, we think it's a partnership, so we'll bring the ice. No, don't thank us.
Well, towels or not, donations or not, calls and emails or not, we are still here, and we'll still be here for episode 105 in just 2 short weeks. But until then, this is Scott Monty.
And this is Bert Wolder, and together we continually say,
the game's
afoot.
I'm afraid that in the pleasure of this conversation I am neglecting business of importance, which awaits me elsewhere.
Thank you for listening. Please be sure to join us again for the next episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast dedicated to Sherlock Holmes.
Goodbye, and good luck, and believe me to be, my dear fellow, very sincerely yours, Sherlock Holmes.